I'm going to show you guys how to build out a quick cutscene using Unity's timeline system, which allows you to animate game objects, play sounds, and transition smoothly into gameplay. So this is a project I have from my 5-minute top-down shooter tutorial. Right now the enemy's just going to chase around the player, and I can shoot the enemy a couple times and it will die and drop something. This is all irrelevant. This is just the scene I have set up right now. So let's go ahead and start making a cutscene. I want to introduce these characters before they start fighting. And so the first thing we need to do is actually get the timeline window open up. To do that, we can go to Window, Sequencing, and then Timeline. So we got our timeline on the bottom here. And now the next thing we actually want to do is create a new empty game object, and we'll call this Timeline, or you can call it Cutscene Manager, whatever you want. But once you have an empty game object, we can now select it in the hierarchy, and you'll see in the timeline window it says we can now create a new timeline. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's hit create. We're now going to save this somewhere in our assets folder. I'll just call this cutscene 0. You can name it whatever you want. And we now have something that looks just like our animation window. It's very similar. And if you have experience with animation or even editing videos, this is going to be very similar in how it works. Essentially, you can right-click on the left, and we have all these different types of tracks we can put in. And then a track group is really just a folder to collect them all for organization. But the first thing we really want to look at is the animation track, because this is kind of the bread and butter tool you're going to be using. And when we create one, you'll see we have an empty animator slot we need to fill. We can start with the player first. So I'll click and drag our player from our hierarchy into this slot. And when we do, it'll prompt us to create an animator on our player if it doesn't exist already, which it doesn't on mine. So I'll say yes, create that, and it will fill with the player animator. And so let's keep this really simple for now. What I want to happen is at the start of the scene, I want my player to come in from the bottom following my mouse to walk up into the scene into a starting position. So what we can do is hit this recording button, and I'm on the first frame here. On the timeline itself, we can move through our sequence just like we could with an animation, but we'll start at the first frame and we'll hit start recording. And now selecting my player, really what I want to do is drag them out of the scene, maybe down to like negative 15 or something like that. Again, this is kind of arbitrary. And then skipping forward a bit, we can reset this back to like -3 in the Y, which is where the player was originally, and stop recording. Okay, so we have a point at the first frame, which is our player off camera, and then after, in this case, 180 frames, it's going to move back to around its starting position. If we play this timeline now, we'll see that our player just slowly creeps into the scene. And if you don't like working in frames like 0 to 180, you can actually hit the gear here and change some settings of the timeline itself. So we can change this from frames to seconds, and you'll see that we're actually doing this in a 3-second interval, which maybe is easier to understand when you're working with this. And so we can make this animation much more complex if we wanted to, but I'm keeping everything purposefully simple. And we have this selection here, right, of 3 seconds. This is what's currently going on. Well, what if we didn't want to play right away? What if we wanted to move this and edit it as a whole? What we can do is right-click in this and do Convert to Clip Track, and you'll see it'll pop up as recorded. We could rename this clip to like Player Entrance or whatever we want to call it, right? And at this point, we can now actually drag around this clip on the timeline. So let's say we didn't want our clip to start for a full second. We could actually drag it over to the 1 second mark and hit play. And now there's an additional second added to our character walking up. And this is really nice, because you can imagine that right now we just have a single game object being animated, but let's say we had 20 in our scene of all these different things going on. Well, we can actually take clips of each of them, and then we can just simply move them around the timeline as one whole and line things up properly and fine-tune things as we go along. And in the case you ever want to edit what's happening in this clip, you can simply right-click and go to Edit an Animation window, and you'll see, just like a regular animation, you can then tweak this one individually. So if we play this animation, you'll see the exact same things happening, and you can actually move these keyframes around or add some new ones, and that will still reflect back to this clip here. So it's all really seamless and really easy to use. So with that said, let's actually go ahead and bring that back to the beginning. And now I'm going to right-click and create a new animation track. And this time I'll go ahead and click and drag on our enemy and put them into this new animator slot, and we'll say create an animator because I don't have one on him. And just like before, what we want to do is hit record on the enemy this time. We'll go ahead and select the enemy. And I'm just going to drag him up out of the screen, maybe to like 10 in the Y. Doesn't really matter for me. This is just an example. And same thing, I'll click on 3 seconds And this time I will then drag him back down into the top of the frame where I want him to be. That looks fine with me, and we can stop recording. So now I can hit play, and you'll see both characters come from out of the screen and meet each other in frame. Just like before, I can go ahead and convert this to a clip track. I'll call this enemy entrance. And now let's say we actually want to offset these. I could go ahead and drag this after the player entrance. And when we play the timeline now, we have our player come in first, then it triggers our enemy track who walks in from the top. So now this is definitely worth noting. If we select on either of our clip tracks here, and we look at our inspector, we have a whole ton of properties we can now fine tune, including like the duration of the clips themselves, which you can also do by just clicking and dragging on the timeline itself. But you have other things too, like the speed multiplier, whether you want the animations to hold after they finish, or loop, or reverse. You'll notice on the player entrance, since it happens at start, there's no pre-extrapolate, but there's things you could do afterwards, such as loop or ping pong, which will reverse through the clip and then go back. But if I click on enemy entrance, you'll see the pre-extrapolate is to hold for 3 seconds, because that's where it aligns in the timeline. If we move this over, you'll see the value updates. And so there's some interesting things you can do here that I'm not going to go too deep into. Really, you can experiment and play around with it as you see fit. So what we have right now is if we actually play the game, right, our player comes in first. I can't move around yet. Our enemy comes in second. And then we get full control of our player and our enemy starts chasing. I can go ahead and shoot. So without having to worry about state or anything like that from the get-go, and granted, you could solve this with animation as well, but this is just a nice, easy way of introducing a quote-unquote cutscene before your game, and something to keep in mind, that if you actually have in-game controls, they'll wait until the timeline finishes, or if a timeline begins, it'll kind of put your gameplay state on hold in most cases, which is really convenient. So now, let's go ahead and show some things you can do with cameras, because right now when we actually hit play, our player's just kind of like walking off from screen, right? We don't really know what's going on. So our main camera's set in the middle of this arena, that's fine. I'm going to duplicate this, and I'll call this player camera. I'll duplicate another and call it enemy camera just for later. And selecting the player camera, I'm going to go ahead and drag this down quite a bit. So now I have a main camera that's set into the middle of the screen. I have a player camera that's focused somewhat down, right? So this should capture the player at the beginning of the timeline before they start walking up. And now I have this enemy camera I can drag up close to 10 in the Y, and that will capture the enemy before he starts walking in as well. And then let's select both the player and enemy camera and disable them. So right now, if you look at my game screen, it's just focused on the main camera. If we go to our timeline, I can right click, I can go to activation track, and this will basically enable a game object, in this case a camera. And so I'll actually shrink the end of this track to about halfway through the player entrance animation. We'll just see what that looks like. It's kind of arbitrary. And we'll drag in our player camera. And then we can do the same thing. We could create another activation track, drag in the enemy camera, and we'll drag it to the start of the enemy entrance and make it about halfway as well. And so I think this is going to actually look really janky. So I just added these 2 squares in to help illustrate what's going on for you guys. This is going to look awful. But if I hit play now, essentially what's going to happen is it'll start on the player camera, go to the main camera, go to the enemy camera, and go back to the main camera. And then the game will resume like normal, and both of the other cameras, if I pause it, the player camera and the enemy camera are disabled. So looking at the timeline, the other cameras will only be enabled during these activation periods. And because the main camera is always enabled, that's just going to be like the default. Hopefully that makes sense. So there's one more thing I want to show you with activation tracks. I have 2 text objects that are exactly the same. I just changed the color. I have fight text red and I have fight text yellow. And the idea is I really want to toggle these on and off so that it flashes, which is going to be very simple when we can do this in a timeline. So let's go ahead and I'll create 2 more activation tracks. I'll drag in my fight text red. I'll drag in my fight text yellow. Let's say after our enemy is in place, we want to wait about a half second. And then we want to flash fight for 2 seconds. So what we can do is set the fight text red for 2 seconds. And then for the fight text yellow, we want to offset this a little bit. Right, so you'll see I shrunk down the fight text yellow to be really small. And what's going to happen is after the enemy gets it to place, right, we wait a little bit. And then the red fight pops on the screen. We keep going. The yellow will pop on momentarily because it's just a short amount. And then it will go back to red. And the reason I'm doing it this way is I want to showcase to you that you can actually copy and paste additional versions of the same track. So here I can actually make a few of these yellows, and I can kind of space them out a bit, right? You can do some science to this so that it actually, looks somewhat consistent. So just by using copy and paste, we now have several different instances of turning this fight text yellow on and off, and it will give us this flashing effect right as we go along. And I'm sure there are other ways to do this, but this works well enough. And now if we actually hit play, you'll see it goes on and off like we want. And so it's worth noting, you can do this with any of these tracks, right? Including our enemy entrance. I could copy and paste this, and now after our enemy moves back into place, he'll kind of teleport back to the top and do it again, right? Which we don't really want, but that's to showcase that you can actually replay these animations over and over again. You don't have to feel like you have to redo it every time or anything like that, so you can get the most out of each of these clips. So anyway, with this in place, the last thing I want to do is now play a sound effect over this fight command, and then once it's finished, the game will begin, more or less. So I have this MP3 here called Fight. Fight! That's me, can you tell? So it's actually really easy to add any sound effect. This is just an MP3. I'm just going to click and drag it underneath where the texts are going on and off, and you'll see it automatically creates an audio track for us. You could also right-click and go to audio track. But it did it for us, and it placed the clip right here. And so I'm just going to go ahead and trigger it near the beginning of the fight text where it first appears. There's a little bit of dead space. You could drag that in if you wanted to. Doesn't really matter to me. So let's go ahead and actually test this out. We can try and run the game. We have our cameras changing just like we set up before. It looks terrible, I'm sorry. They move into place. Fight! It plays the sound, it plays the text, the game begins, I can now move around, and you'll notice the red text is obviously staying on screen, which is not what we want. So why is this happening? In fact, my two text objects here, the fight text red and fight text yellow, are disabled, so this definitely should not be happening. Looking at our timeline, you may notice we have this blue marker here at the end of our cutscene, and that's exactly what it signifies. It's the last frame available in our cutscene. And even if we zoom in all the way, right here we have our fight text red on, and while it should be disabling at this last frame, I don't think it actually is. At least that's my running theory. So one thing we can do is actually adjust our timeline settings, which again is this gear icon on the side. We can click that and go to duration mode. And right now it's doing based on clips, but we could also set this to fixed length, and that now lets this blue line become adjustable. So I'll click and drag it out, I don't know, 5 seconds or 5 milliseconds from there. And we can go ahead and test this now that there's a little bit more buffer room between the end of that frame. So we'll hit play, we'll see our cameras moving around, it looks terrible again, I'm sorry. They move into place, it plays the sound and the text, and now it disappears as I expected. And so I don't really know why this is a bug. There's probably other better ways of fixing that maybe, but that's a simple enough way for me. I can now go ahead and play the game and kill the enemy, and that's it. We have a working cutscene to start off our game. Even though it kind of looks like crap, you still get an idea of some of the tools available to you. So that's the general idea. I hope this tutorial helped you guys out and got started building your own cutscenes. And make sure if it helped you, you subscribe to the channel. See you guys in the next one.